Freedom. It is a word so powerful that it can shake empires and ignite hearts across oceans. But in the mid-18th century, freedom was only a whisper, a distant dream buried beneath the weight of kings and crowns. Across the Atlantic Ocean, 13 colonies thrived on the edge of a vast wilderness, loyal yet restless under the British flag. They were farmers, merchants, and thinkers. They spoke the same language as their rulers, followed the same faith, and yet something deep within them began to stir, a question no empire wants to hear. Why should we be ruled by those who do not know our lives? The American story did not begin with a single moment of defiance, but with a slow burn of frustration. The colonies were growing fast, rich in trade and ideas, yet their prosperity filled only the coffers of the British Crown. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain turned to its colonies to pay the debt. Taxes, once modest, became suffocating. The Stamp Act of 1765 demanded that every printed document bear a costly royal seal, from newspapers to marriage licenses. For the first time, ordinary men and women felt the heavy hand of distant power press against their daily lives. In taverns and meeting halls, voices rose in anger. Pamphlets spread from town to town like sparks in dry grass. The cry was simple: no taxation without representation. To the British Parliament, it was a slogan of insolence. To the colonists, it was the truth. They were Englishmen in name, but subjects without a voice. The Stamp Act protests turned into boycotts. British goods were burned in the streets, and though the Crown repealed the act, it did not forgive the disobedience. The tension between mother and child began to harden into resentment. Then came the blood on the cobblestones. In 1770, in the heart of Boston, soldiers of the Empire stood against an angry crowd. Snowballs turned to stones, shouts to gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. The British called it an accident. The people called it murder. The Boston Massacre. The name alone carried fire. Across the colonies, word of the killing spread, carried by riders, printed in papers, whispered in churches. The trust between Britain and her colonies was breaking, and no amount of royal decree could mend it. Yet the spark that would light the world was still to come. On a cold December night in 1773, men disguised as Mohawk Indians crept aboard ships in Boston Harbor. They worked swiftly and silently, breaking open chests of British tea and casting them into the dark water. It was not about tea. It was about defiance. The moment when obedience drowned in salt water. The Boston Tea Party was a message to the king. We will no longer kneel. The Crown answered with fury. The port of Boston was closed. Soldiers filled its streets. The people called these laws the Intolerable Acts, and indeed, they were intolerable. Across the colonies, unity began to form where division once stood. From Virginia to Massachusetts, delegates gathered to form the First Continental Congress. Men like George Washington, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson met under candlelight, not as rebels, but as citizens desperate to reason with their king. They pleaded for fairness, not freedom, at least not yet. But in London, their petitions were ignored. To the Crown, these men were not diplomats, they were troublemakers. The stage was set. The winds of rebellion began to blow stronger with each passing month. In the spring of 1775, tension turned to thunder. In the quiet town of Lexington, British soldiers marched under orders to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord. But on the village green, they were met by a handful of farmers and tradesmen, ordinary men armed with muskets, their hands trembling yet resolute. "Stand your ground," their captain said. "Don't fire unless fired upon." And then, from somewhere, No one knows who shot first. A single gun cracked through the morning mist. The shot heard round the world. That moment changed everything. The rebellion was no longer whispered, it was shouted in gunfire and smoke. Britain's might was unmatched, yet the colonies refused to yield. Farmers became soldiers, blacksmiths became patriots, and across the countryside bells rang and messengers rode to spread the news. The war had begun. The world watched as 13 scattered colonies stood against the greatest military power of their age. To many it seemed foolish, even suicidal. But in the hearts of those who dared to dream of liberty, it was destiny. The seeds of rebellion had taken root, watered with courage and hope, and as the British marched back from Concord, under fire from hidden militants, the long, painful birth of a new nation had begun. The thunder of muskets at Lexington and Concord echoed far beyond Massachusetts. It reached the ears of every man and woman who longed to live free. The British had expected the colonists to scatter in fear, but instead they stood their ground and fought back. It was no longer a protest, it was war. The British soldiers retreated under constant gunfire from farmers hiding behind stone walls and trees. The people of New England had turned the countryside into a battlefield. What began as a mission to seize weapons ended as the first British retreat of the war. As word spread through the colonies, an army began to form. Not a professional army, but a gathering of volunteers. Men carried old hunting rifles, wore mismatched clothing, and stood shoulder to shoulder, united by a single purpose: to defend their land and their liberty. From every colony they came, and they called themselves the Continental Army. But an army needs a leader. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia to make a decision that would change the fate of the continent. After days of debate, one name rose above the rest: George Washington. Washington was a tall, commanding figure from Virginia, known for his calm strength and honor. He had served as an officer during the French and Indian War and carried himself with dignity and quiet confidence. When Congress chose him as commander-in-chief, he did not celebrate. Instead, he accepted with humility, saying, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." Yet deep down he understood the weight of what lay ahead. He would not only lead men into battle, he would lead a revolution. That same month, the war's first major clash erupted on the hills outside Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill was fought in smoke and chaos. The colonists built defenses on a nearby ridge and waited as the red-coated British soldiers marched uphill in perfect formation. 3 times they advanced, and twice they were thrown back by fierce colonial fire. Ammunition ran low, and the Americans finally retreated, but not before inflicting devastating losses on the British. Nearly 1,000 redcoats fell. The message was clear: the colonies could fight, and fight hard. Washington soon arrived in Cambridge to take command. He found a ragtag force, brave but undisciplined. There were no uniforms, no training, and few supplies. Yet as he rode through the camp, his presence inspired respect. Under his leadership, the Continental Army began to take shape. Drills were held daily, supplies were gathered, and discipline was enforced. Washington understood that to stand against an empire, his men had to become more than rebels. They had to become soldiers. Meanwhile, in London, King George III's patience had run out. He declared the colonies to be an open rebellion and vowed to crush them with overwhelming force. Ships filled with soldiers crossed the Atlantic. Mercenaries from Germany, the Hessians, were hired to fight. To the king, it was a matter of restoring order. To the colonists, it was now a struggle for survival. Through the bitter winter of 1775, Washington's army held its ground outside Boston. Supplies were scarce, and morale wavered.
Yet courage persisted. Then in early 1776, a daring young bookseller named Henry Knox arrived with something extraordinary. Cannons hauled all the way from Fort Ticonderoga through snow and mountains. Washington placed them on the high ground overlooking Boston. When the British awoke to see the guns aimed directly at them, they realized the city was lost. Without a shot, Washington forced them to withdraw. Boston was free. But freedom was still a fragile dream. Across the sea, Britain prepared an even greater army. That summer, their ships filled the horizon near New York, the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. Over 30,000 soldiers, armed with precision and power, ready to crush the rebellion in one swift blow. Washington knew the coming battle would test the revolution's very existence. The fighting around New York was brutal. Washington's men were outnumbered, outgunned, and inexperienced. They fought bravely, but suffered heavy losses. The British captured New York City and forced Washington to retreat across New Jersey. Many began to lose hope. The dream of independence seemed to be slipping away. But Washington would not surrender. He believed the war could not be won in a single victory. It had to be endured, fought over time with patience and resolve. As winter approached, the army was cold, tired, and on the brink of collapse. Enlistments were ending, and many soldiers wanted to go home. Then, on a dark night in December 1776, Washington made a bold decision. He led his men across the icy Delaware River to strike the enemy unexpectedly. The attack came at dawn on the town of Trenton, where Hessian soldiers lay sleeping after Christmas celebrations. In a burst of courage and desperation, Washington's army overwhelmed them. It was a small victory by scale, but a massive one in spirit. It reminded the world and the colonists that this fight was far from over. The next year would bring more battles, more losses, and more sacrifice. But something had changed after Trenton. The revolution had found its heartbeat. Washington had proven that courage and strategy could defy cower and fear. The army was still fragile, but the idea of freedom had become unbreakable. The war was far from won, but in the frozen rivers and silent nights of 1776, a nation's resolve had been forged. The colonies had not only found their general, they had found their belief that liberty was worth any price.
The winter of 1777 arrived with darkness, hunger, and despair. The Continental Army had endured defeat after defeat. Philadelphia, the heart of the Revolution, had fallen into British hands. Congress had fled. The soldiers, barefoot and starving, trudged through snow toward a small place in Pennsylvania called Valley Forge. It was not a fortress, but a frozen wasteland. Here, Washington's men built crude huts from logs and mud. Smoke rose from thousands of small fires as they huddled together for warmth, wrapping rags around their bleeding feet. They were not fighting the British that winter. They were fighting hunger, cold, and hopelessness. Yet within that suffering, something extraordinary happened. Valley Forge became the crucible that transformed rebellion into resilience. Washington never left his men's side. He walked among them every day, his coat tattered like theirs, sharing their pain. He wrote desperate letters for food, blankets, and shoes. He watched his soldiers endure disease and frostbite, but never lose faith in the cause. Amid the suffering, a man arrived who would change everything. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a gift for discipline and organization. Von Steuben spoke little English, but through broken words and fierce energy, he trained the army in modern warfare. He drilled them tirelessly, how to march, reload faster, fight in formation, and move as one body. The men who had once scattered in confusion learned to stand firm under fire.
By the time the snows of Valley Forge melted, the Continental Army had been reborn. They were no longer a band of farmers with muskets. They were soldiers, hardened by suffering and united by purpose. While the army transformed in the cold, hope was kindling abroad. In Europe, the world watched the rebellion with fascination. Most believed the colonies could never stand against the might of Britain. But then came the Battle of Saratoga, the victory that changed everything. In the summer of 1777, British General John Burgoyne led a grand army south from Canada, intending to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. His plan was bold, but his arrogance blinded him. The Americans, under General Horatio Gates and the daring young Benedict Arnold, fought fiercely in the forests of upstate New York. The battles were chaotic and brutal. American sharpshooters picked off British officers from the trees. Burgoyne's army, bogged down in swamps and wilderness, ran short of supplies. In October 1777, surrounded and defeated, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of 6,000 men at Saratoga. For the first time, the impossible had happened. A British army had been forced to surrender to colonial rebels. The news spread like fire across the Atlantic. In Paris, French diplomats saw a chance to strike their old enemy Britain by aiding the American cause. After years of hesitation, France officially recognized the United States as an independent nation and pledged military support. The revolution was no longer just a colonial uprising. It had become an international war. The alliance with France brought money, supplies, and most importantly, a navy. Ships flying the fleur-de-lis sailed across the Atlantic to join the fight. French officers, including the young Marquis de Lafayette, crossed the ocean to stand beside Washington. Lafayette, barely in his 20s, became like a son to him, brave, idealistic, and devoted to liberty. Together, they shared the belief that freedom was a right, not a privilege. By 1778, the tide of the war had begun to turn. The Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge stronger than ever. When they faced the British at Monmouth, they fought with discipline and confidence, forcing the enemy to retreat under the blazing summer sun. For the first time, Washington's army stood toe-to-toe with the Redcoats and did not break. Still, victory was far from certain. The war dragged on, moving southward. British generals shifted their focus to the Carolinas, hoping to rally loyalists and crush the rebellion from within. The conflict became crueler, more personal. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Villages were burned, families torn apart. But everywhere the British advanced, they found a people unwilling to surrender. Guerrilla fighters, led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, struck from forests and swamps, vanishing before the British could strike back. As the years passed, the dream of independence endured through fire and blood. The revolution was no longer just a fight for land or taxes. It had become something deeper, a war for the human spirit, a declaration that ordinary people could choose their own destiny.
By the year 1781, the American Revolution had raged for 6 long, punishing years. The land was scarred by battle, and the people were weary. Towns lay in ashes, families were divided, and the hope for freedom flickered like a dying candle. Yet that small flame refused to go out. George Washington's army, though exhausted and underfed, still stood. Across the sea, the British Empire was stretched thin, fighting not only the Americans, but now France and Spain as well. The struggle that had begun as a rebellion of farmers had grown into a global war. The British had shifted their focus south, capturing Charleston and Savannah, believing the South was filled with loyalists who would welcome the crown. But they misjudged the spirit of the people.
In the backcountry, small bands of American fighters waged relentless guerrilla warfare, ambushing supply lines and vanishing into forests and swamps. Each skirmish drained British strength and morale. The war had become a grind, and the British were bleeding slowly, unable to control what they claimed to rule. Meanwhile, Washington watched from the north, waiting for an opportunity to strike a decisive blow. That chance came when British General Charles Cornwallis, after months of fighting in the Carolinas, moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia. It was a strategic mistake. Yorktown sat on a narrow peninsula surrounded by rivers and the sea, an easy place to trap an army if one had the power to do it. And for the first time, Washington did. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed from the Caribbean and took control of the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by sea. At the same time, Washington and his French ally, General Rochambeau, marched their combined army south from New York, covering hundreds of miles in secrecy. Thousands of soldiers, American and French, moved with precision and determination. As they approached Yorktown, Cornwallis found himself surrounded, the noose tightening slowly around him. In October 1781, the siege of Yorktown began. Day and night, American and French cannons thundered against British defenses. The sky lit up with fire as shells screamed through the darkness. Washington himself stood on the front lines, directing the bombardment. His soldiers dug trenches closer and closer to the enemy lines, advancing under constant fire. The British fought bravely, but the walls began to crumble. Hunger and disease spread through their camp. The great army of King George was trapped. On the morning of October 17th, white flags appeared above the British ramparts. The sound of drums echoed through the smoke as messengers approached Washington's camp. General Cornwallis, cornered and defeated, had requested to surrender. 2 days later, in a quiet field outside Yorktown, the British Army lay down its arms. Soldiers who had once marched proudly in redcoats now stood silent, their muskets stacked, their banners furled. The band played a melancholy tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Indeed, the world had turned. An empire built on centuries of power had been humbled by a people who refused to bow. Washington, ever dignified, refused to gloat. He accepted the surrender with solemn grace, knowing that this victory belonged not to him alone, but to every man and woman who had suffered, sacrificed, and dreamed of freedom. When news of Yorktown reached London, disbelief turned to despair. The British Parliament, weary of the endless cost and bloodshed, finally urged the king to end the war. Negotiations began in Paris, and on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The war was over. The dream had become reality. As Washington bid farewell to his troops in New York, tears filled the eyes of men who had endured 8 years of unimaginable hardship. They had entered the war as farmers and merchants. They left it as soldiers of a new nation. Washington, refusing the chance to become a king himself, returned to his farm at Mount Vernon, choosing peace over power. His humility became the foundation of a nation built not on conquest, but on ideals. The revolution had begun as a fight over taxes and representation, but it ended as something much greater. A declaration to the world that ordinary people had the right to govern themselves. It inspired revolutions across Europe and beyond. It redefined what it meant to be free. Yet the story of America did not end with independence. It was only the beginning, a promise written in hope and sealed with sacrifice. The birth of the United States was not the triumph of one man or one army, but of a belief that liberty, once awakened, could never again be chained. From the blood-soaked fields of Lexington to the quiet surrender at Yorktown, that belief carried a nation through fire and darkness into the light of freedom. And though centuries have passed, the echo of that struggle still lives on, in every voice that dares to question authority, in every heart that believes in equality, and in every dream that begins with the words, "We the people."